Some children grow up learning how to speak. Others grow up learning how to disappear. Alishba belonged to the second kind. From the very beginning, she was described in terms that carried weight she never understood. Too sensitive, too intense, too demanding. Words like these followed her quietly, attaching themselves to her presence long before she had the language to defend herself. She did not hear them spoken loudly, but she felt their consequences everywhere. Her parents were not cruel in obvious ways. They were successful, respected, and admired from the outside. Their lives moved with structure and purpose, built carefully around ambition and reputation. They valued excellence, composure, and results. Emotion, when it appeared, was something to be managed rather than explored. Alishba did not fit easily into that design. She felt things deeply, often without understanding why. Small changes unsettled her. Silence affected her more than noise. She asked questions that made adults uncomfortable because they did not have clean answers. She noticed absences others ignored. She remembered moments others forgot. This made her inconvenient. As a child, she tried to adjust herself to the shape of what was expected. She learned quickly that approval was conditional. That affection arrived when she performed correctly and disappeared when she failed to be easy. She learned that being loved required effort, and effort did not guarantee success. Her parents interpreted her emotional needs as flaws. They spoke of resilience, discipline, and strength, assuming these qualities emerged naturally in environments where feelings were minimized. They believed love should toughen a child, not soften them. Alishba absorbed this belief before she could question it. She began to monitor herself closely. She learned when to stay quiet, when to shrink, when to disappear into the background of her own life. She learned that expressing need created distance. That vulnerability disrupted order. Still, she tried. She tried through achievement, through obedience, through excellence that demanded acknowledgement. She excelled academically, not because she loved competition, but because success was the only language that earned attention in her home. Even then, it was never enough. Praise came wrapped in comparison. Approval came with conditions. Pride was measured, calculated, and often redirected toward future expectations rather than present effort. Alishba learned that love, in her world, was something to be earned repeatedly. And even then, it could be withdrawn without warning. As she grew older, the gap between her inner world and her family's expectations widened. Her parents viewed emotional expression as instability. Alishba experienced it as honesty. This difference became a fault line that shaped every interaction. She was told, directly and indirectly, that she was difficult, that she required more than others, that loving her took effort that should not be necessary. These messages did not arrive in a single moment. They accumulated slowly, shaping her self-perception over years. Each dismissal, each unmet need, each withheld comfort added weight to the idea that she was inherently flawed. By adolescence, Alishba no longer asked to be understood. She asked only not to be a burden. Her parents' success expanded during these years. Their careers flourished. Their influence grew. Their lives became increasingly public. Appearances mattered more than ever. Control became essential. Alishba, with her questions and emotions, did not fit into the image they carefully curated. She was encouraged to be independent earlier than necessary, to handle things on her own, to stop seeking reassurance. The message was clear even when the words were not spoken. She was too much. Eventually, the distance became explicit. Emotional withdrawal transformed into practical separation. Support became conditional. Guidance became criticism. Presence became absence. By the time Alishba reached adulthood, the foundation of her relationship with her parents was already fractured beyond recognition. The final break did not come with shouting or drama. It came with clarity. She was told, calmly and decisively, that maintaining a relationship with her required energy they were no longer willing to give, that her emotional needs disrupted their lives. That distance would be healthier for everyone involved. They framed it as necessity, as self-preservation. as a difficult but logical choice. For Elishba, it felt like confirmation. She had always suspected that love was fragile where she was concerned. Now she knew it was conditional enough to be removed entirely. The cutoff was complete. Financial support ended. Emotional contact ceased. She was excluded from conversations, milestones, and acknowledgments. She became a closed chapter in a family narrative that continued without her. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was disorienting. Elishba found herself untethered, grieving not only the loss of her parents, but the loss of the idea that she could ever become someone worthy of their love. The rejection reached backward, rewriting her memories, casting doubt on moments she once believed were genuine. She questioned herself constantly, wondered what she could have done differently, considered whether she truly was too difficult to love. Yet beneath the pain, something else stirred. Freed from the constant need to prove her worth, Elishba encountered an unfamiliar sensation. Space. Silence that belonged to her rather than being imposed on her. It frightened her. Without her parents' expectations shaping her every decision, she had to confront who she was without external validation. The prospect felt overwhelming, but also strangely honest. She stood at the edge of a life she had never been allowed to imagine. Cut off, unprotected, unloved in the ways that mattered most, and yet alive. This was not the beginning of her revenge. It was the beginning of her survival. Freedom did not arrive gently for Elishba. It arrived like a sudden drop, like ground disappearing beneath her feet before she had learned how to land. The separation from her parents did not feel like release. It felt like exposure. Every safety net she had assumed existed, even conditionally, was suddenly gone. For the first time in her life, there was no authority watching her progress, no looming judgment shaping her choices, no invisible checklist she had to meet to justify her existence. What should have felt empowering instead felt paralyzing. She had been raised to believe that worth came from approval. Without it, she struggled to measure herself at all. Her days became quiet in a way she had never known. Not the heavy silence of punishment or emotional withdrawal, but the unstructured quiet of independence. She woke up without expectation, went to sleep without reassurance. There were no messages to check, no demands to anticipate, no disappointments to brace herself for. At first, she filled the emptiness with exhaustion. She worked longer hours than necessary, took on responsibilities that drained her, pushed herself relentlessly. Productivity became a substitute for belonging. If she could not be loved, she could at least be useful. If she could not be wanted, she could be indispensable. But even usefulness failed to soothe the deeper wound. At night, when distractions faded, the questions returned. Who was she without resistance? Who was she when no one was evaluating her performance? She realized how little she knew herself beyond survival. Her emotions, once criticized and minimized, surfaced without restraint. Grief came in waves. Anger followed, then guilt, then longing. She mourned not only the loss of her parents, but the version of herself that had spent years trying to earn something that was never freely given. There were moments she nearly reached out, not because the pain had disappeared, but because it had become familiar. Rejection, at least, was predictable. Independence demanded courage she was not sure she possessed yet. Still, she did not go back. Something within her resisted returning to a place where her existence required justification. That resistance was fragile, but it was real. Elishba began to observe herself differently. Without judgment imposed from the outside, she noticed patterns she had never been allowed to acknowledge. How she anticipated disappointment before it arrived. How she apologized for needs she had every right to express. How she equated rest with laziness and ambition with morality. These realizations were uncomfortable. They forced her to confront the ways she had internalized rejection and turned it inward. She sought understanding quietly, through books that articulated emotions she had never been taught to name, through long walks where thoughts could rise and fall without interruption, through moments of stillness that initially felt unbearable but gradually became grounding. Healing did not announce itself dramatically. It appeared in subtle shifts. She stopped flinching when she made mistakes. She allowed herself to feel pride without immediately anticipating criticism. She began to differentiate between discomfort and danger, recognizing that not all vulnerability led to harm. The absence of her parents created room for new connections, though she approached them cautiously. Trust did not come easily. She had learned that closeness could disappear without warning, but she also learned that distance did not guarantee safety. Slowly, she allowed herself to be seen by people who expected nothing from her except honesty. These relationships felt foreign at first. They did not require performance. They did not measure affection. They existed without constant evaluation. It unsettled her. She questioned their sincerity, waiting for conditions to surface. But over time, consistency replaced suspicion. She began to understand that not all love was transactional. This realization challenged everything she had been taught. Alishba's sense of self began to stabilize, not because her life became easier, but because she stopped defining herself through rejection. She learned to recognize her emotional depth not as a flaw, but as sensitivity sharpened by neglect. What her parents had labeled difficult, the world began to reveal as perceptive. What they had dismissed as weakness emerged as awareness. She redirected her focus toward her own growth. Education became a tool rather than a test. Work became a platform rather than a verdict. She chose environments that valued contribution without control, effort without erasure. For the first time, her ambitions belonged to her. She pursued mastery quietly, not to prove anything, but to anchor herself in competence. Knowledge became grounding. Skill became confidence. Each achievement reinforced the idea that she was capable without approval. Her parents' absence faded from constant ache into distant presence. They were no longer the central force shaping her identity. They became part of her history rather than the architects of her future. Yet their influence lingered in subtler ways. Whenever she succeeded, a part of her expected acknowledgement that never came. Whenever she failed, she braced for rejection that no longer existed. Healing, she realized, was not about erasing the past, but learning to live without its permission. She practiced setting boundaries, first internally, then externally. She learned to say no without apology, to recognize when her empathy was being exploited, to choose peace over proximity. These skills did not make her cold. They made her clear. The idea of reconciliation crossed her mind occasionally, not as a desire, but as a hypothetical. She wondered what it would take for her parents to see her differently. Then she recognized the trap in the question. She did not need to be seen differently to exist fully. The moment this truth settled, something fundamental shifted. Her life stopped orbiting the absence of her parents. It began to expand outward, guided by her own values. She made decisions based on alignment rather than approval. She invested energy where it was reciprocated. She stopped shrinking to preserve harmony. And with that growth came visibility. Her work began to attract attention. Her competence drew recognition. Opportunities emerged that placed her in spaces once reserved for people like her parents. She noticed this coincidence with quiet irony. The world that had once seemed inaccessible now opened slowly, deliberately, without requiring her to abandon herself. She was no longer surviving rejection. She was building something independent of it. This stage of her life did not feel triumphant. It felt steady, grounded, real. The kind of progress that does not announce itself, but reshapes everything underneath. Alishba did not yet understand how deeply her path would intersect with the world her parents dominated. She did not anticipate the power her independence would eventually grant her. She only knew one thing. She no longer needed permission to exist. And that knowledge would change everything that came next. There is a moment in every self-made life when progress stops feeling private. When growth, once invisible and personal, begins to cast a shadow others can see. For Alishba, that moment did not arrive suddenly. It built slowly, quietly, through consistency rather than spectacle. She had learned to work without witnesses. In the years following her separation from her parents, She refined her focus with an intensity that surprised even her. Not driven by revenge or comparison, but by a need for stability that came from within. Her efforts were methodical. She chose mastery over speed, depth over display. She did not chase recognition. She built substance. That choice changed everything. Her reputation began to form before she noticed it. Colleagues recognized her reliability. Supervisors trusted her judgment. Projects placed in her care did not simply succeed. They stabilized entire systems. She became known for precision, foresight, and an unusual ability to anticipate problems before they escalated. This competence did not make her loud. It made her unavoidable. Alishba moved through professional spaces with quiet authority. She listened more than she spoke. She observed dynamics others ignored. She noticed how power flowed, how decisions were influenced, how reputations were protected. Her emotional sensitivity, once dismissed as weakness, sharpened into strategic awareness. She understood people deeply. This understanding allowed her to navigate complexity without confrontation. She did not need to assert dominance. Her work spoke on her behalf. Her consistency established credibility that could not be dismissed. Opportunities expanded naturally around her. She was invited into rooms she had never imagined entering, not because she demanded access, but because her presence made outcomes better. Her name became associated with trust. Her involvement signaled stability. As her influence grew, so did the scope of her work. She found herself contributing to projects with national visibility, collaborating with institutions that shaped policy and public narrative. The scale was unfamiliar, but the principles remained the same. Precision, integrity, accountability. She approached each responsibility with the same discipline that had carried her through isolation. She did not inflate her achievements or minimize her efforts. She treated success as stewardship rather than entitlement. This mindset distinguished her. Alishba's career trajectory accelerated, not in bursts, but in steady ascent. Each role expanded her understanding of systems and power. Each transition increased her access to information that shaped outcomes far beyond her immediate responsibilities. She learned how reputations were constructed, how public trust was maintained, how fragile authority became once exposed to scrutiny. These insights did not make her cynical. They made her careful. She began to recognize patterns that mirrored her family dynamic on a larger scale. Control disguised as protection. Authority justified by convenience. Silence used to maintain order. The familiarity unsettled her, but it also clarified her purpose. She did not seek to dominate these systems. She sought to understand them fully. Knowledge became leverage. Transparency became influence. She realized that true power rarely announced itself. It operated quietly, embedded in processes and decisions that shaped everything downstream. Alishba positioned herself accordingly. Her work began to intersect with public figures, institutions, and industries that valued discretion as much as competence. She became a trusted presence in environments where mistakes carried reputational consequences. Her parents' world. At first, the overlap was abstract. Names appeared in documents. Networks overlapped indirectly. She recognized affiliations without assigning meaning to them. She had learned not to center her life around their presence or absence. But as her visibility increased, the distance narrowed. Her parents' careers had continued to flourish after cutting her off. They occupied positions that relied heavily on credibility and public perception. Their authority rested on narratives of stability, discipline, and moral clarity. Narratives Alishba now understood intimately. She began to encounter their influence in professional contexts, not as family, but as entities within systems she now navigated. Their names carried weight. Their reputations opened doors. So did hers. This convergence did not evoke fear or anger. It evoked clarity. Alishba saw how interconnected success truly was, how fragile it became when built on unchecked assumptions, how quickly influence could shift when accountability entered the frame. She did not plan confrontation. She did not seek retribution. She simply continued doing her work with the same rigor that had carried her this far. And that work began to matter. Her contributions influenced decisions that shaped industries. Her analyses informed strategies that affected public trust. Her presence in critical processes ensured compliance, where shortcuts were once taken. She became, without intending to, a guardian of integrity. People trusted her because she did not chase visibility. She did not use power to elevate herself. She used it to stabilize systems that others relied on. This trust compounded. With time, her authority became undeniable. She was no longer an emerging talent. She was an established force. Her name appeared in contexts that carried weight. Her judgment influenced outcomes with lasting impact. The irony was not lost on her. The child once deemed too difficult to love had become someone too competent to ignore. She did not feel satisfaction in this realization. She felt distance, a calm awareness that her life had outgrown the narrow definitions that once confined her. Her parents' absence no longer defined her. Their approval no longer mattered. And yet, their world had begun to intersect with hers in ways that could not be avoided. Not because she pursued them, but because power eventually reveals proximity. Elishba sensed the shift before it became explicit. She noticed changes in how others spoke about shared networks, how her name was mentioned with respect in circles that once excluded her entirely. She understood that visibility carried responsibility. She did not yet know how directly her path would cross with her parents. She did not know the form that reckoning would take. But she recognized that the conditions were forming, not for revenge, for consequence. She had not built her life to prove them wrong. She had built it to stand without them. And now, that strength was impossible to overlook. Power rarely announces itself when it arrives. It settles in quietly, threading itself into processes, decisions, and outcomes until it becomes essential. By the time people notice it, removing it feels impossible. Elishba did not seek this kind of power, but she recognized it when it began to take shape around her. Her role expanded naturally, not through ambition alone, but through necessity. Systems grew more complex. Risks multiplied. Institutions needed people who could be trusted to see what others missed and act before problems surfaced. Elishba had proven, again and again, that she could do exactly that. Her work moved closer to the center. She found herself overseeing frameworks that govern compliance, ethics, and reputation management. Areas others avoided because they invited scrutiny and accountability. Elishba stepped into them with calm precision. She did not dramatize risk. She measured it. She did not react emotionally. She anticipated. This made her invaluable. Decisions began to route through her assessments. Her recommendations carried weight not because of her title, but because of her accuracy. When she flagged an issue, it mattered. When she approved a process, it held. She understood how fragile credibility could be, how quickly years of success could unravel under the wrong kind of attention. This understanding guided her approach. She protected systems by strengthening them, not shielding them. Ironically, this philosophy aligned perfectly with the public images her parents had built their careers upon. They were figures whose authority relied heavily on perception, on narratives of control, discipline, and reliability. Their success depended not only on performance, but on the absence of controversy. Reputation was their currency, and reputation now fell within Elishba's domain. At first, the overlap was indirect. Her work influenced policies that affected industries her parents operated in. Regulations tightened. Oversight increased. Transparency became less optional. The environment shifted subtly, but decisively. Those who adapted thrived. Those who relied on old assumptions struggled. Elishba noticed the tension in the systems she managed. Resistance surfaced in familiar patterns. Attempts to bypass procedure. Efforts to minimize oversight. Appeals to authority rather than evidence. She recognized these patterns intimately. She addressed them the same way she addressed everything else. Calmly, thoroughly, without personal attachment. She applied standards consistently, regardless of status or influence. This consistency unsettled those accustomed to exception. Over time, her influence became structural. Processes she designed shaped outcomes long after her direct involvement ended. She created safeguards that made certain shortcuts impossible. She reinforced accountability in ways that could not be undone quietly. Her parents' world began to feel the effects. Their professional environments grew less forgiving. Scrutiny increased. Documentation mattered more. Compliance was no longer a formality. It was enforced. Elishba did not observe this with satisfaction. She observed it with clarity. Systems corrected themselves when pressure was applied evenly. What she did not expect was how quickly dependency would form. As challenges mounted, organizations sought guidance from those who understood the new landscape, from those who could navigate scrutiny without compromising integrity. Elishba became one of those people. Her expertise was requested more frequently. Her assessments became central to strategic decisions. When crises loomed, her involvement was sought early. She noticed a shift in how authority flowed. Influence no longer rested solely on position. It rested on trust, and trust increasingly pointed toward her. The irony deepened as her professional reach expanded into spaces adjacent to her parents' careers. Institutions that once celebrated their leadership now required validation that passed through systems Elishba helped design or oversee. The connection remained unspoken, but it was undeniable. Their stability now depended, indirectly, on the frameworks she upheld. Elishba processed this realization with detachment. She did not feel vindicated. She felt grounded. The convergence was not personal. It was structural. Her competence had placed her in a position where her presence mattered. What she chose to do with that mattered more. She did not compromise her principles. She did not soften standards out of nostalgia or resentment. She applied the same rigor universally. Fairness, she had learned, was the most powerful form of authority. This fairness altered dynamics quickly. Those accustomed to privilege found themselves accountable. Those who valued integrity found support. The system began to reward transparency rather than connections. Elishba became associated with this shift. Her name carried meaning beyond individual achievement. It represented reliability in uncertain environments. It represented correction without chaos, stability without suppression. People trusted her not to protect power, but to balance it. As this reputation solidified, her presence became unavoidable. Not because she demanded recognition, but because outcomes depended on her involvement. Her parents' names surfaced more frequently in the periphery of her work, not as family, but as stakeholders navigating a system that no longer bent easily. Elishba did not avoid this reality. She acknowledged it internally and continued forward. Her focus remained on the integrity of her work, not on who it affected. Still, the emotional weight of the convergence could not be ignored. She reflected on the contrast between the child they had dismissed and the professional whose decisions now shaped environments they relied upon. The irony was stark, but it did not feel triumphant. It felt instructive. She understood now that rejection had not diminished her. It had redirected her. It had forced her to build confidence without shortcuts, resilience without validation, authority without entitlement. These qualities could not be taken away. The systems she influenced continued to evolve. Accountability deepened. Oversight became normalized. The culture shifted from assumption to verification. And within that shift, dependency solidified, not on Elishba as a person, but on what she represented: clarity, fairness, uncompromising integrity. She did not yet know how directly this dependency would manifest in her parents' lives. She did not know what moment would bring their paths into direct alignment, but she knew the conditions were set. The world they had built now relied on structures she protected, and soon, that reality would become impossible to ignore. Required documentation. Oversight appeared where there had previously been trust. Nothing was openly hostile, nothing dramatic, just a shift in rhythm that made familiar spaces feel unfamiliar. Elishba recognized the pattern immediately. She had helped design it. She had seen how unchecked power aged into complacency, how success created blind spots, how systems built around individuals eventually collapsed under their own exceptions. Her work had been about preventing that collapse, even when it made people uncomfortable. Now, that discomfort was reaching closer to home. Her parents' professional circles began to change tone. Confidence gave way to irritation. Irritation hardened into anxiety. Decisions that once felt guaranteed became conditional. The margin for error narrowed. Alishba observed all of this from a distance. She did not track their struggles obsessively, but the overlap was impossible to miss. Their industries were intersecting with reforms she had influenced. Standards she had reinforced were being enforced without hesitation. This was not coincidence. It was consequence. The moment control truly began to slip came not with confrontation, but with refusal. A process halted, an exception denied. A request returned unanswered because it no longer met requirements. The system did not argue. It simply did not comply. That silence was louder than any accusation. Alishba understood what that silence meant. It meant the system no longer recognized authority based on identity. It recognized only alignment with rules. And those rules no longer bent. Her parents responded the only way they knew how, by pushing harder, by invoking legacy, contribution, influence. But these appeals landed in a framework that no longer translated them into advantage. The ground beneath them had shifted. Meanwhile, Alishba's role deepened. She was now part of strategic conversations that determined how institutions responded to risk. She evaluated vulnerabilities, mapped exposure, and recommended safeguards that would be implemented without delay. Her work was no longer just preventative. It was corrective. She found herself in rooms where reputations were weighed against evidence, where history mattered less than compliance, where outcomes depended on transparency rather than control. She noticed how often resistance came from those accustomed to dominance, how unfamiliar accountability felt to those who had never needed it. She also noticed how calm she remained. This was the difference between inherited authority and earned authority. One resisted scrutiny, the other invited it. As systems tightened, consequences followed. Projects stalled. Partnerships were reconsidered. Oversight intensified. Each adjustment reduced flexibility for those who had relied on influence rather than structure. Alishba's parents began to lose their grip not because someone took it from them, but because it no longer had anything to hold on to. The realization unsettled them. Their world had been built on predictability, on knowing which levers to pull and which doors would open. Now, the levers did nothing. The doors required keys they did not possess. Alishba felt the weight of this shift more deeply than she expected, not as guilt and not as triumph, but as a sober recognition of cause and effect. She had not engineered their decline. She had engineered fairness. Fairness, she had learned, was indifferent. She continued her work with precision. She documented everything. She insisted on clarity. She reinforced processes that left no room for ambiguity. The system responded by stabilizing. Others noticed. Her influence became more visible. Leaders sought her input not just for crisis management, but for long-term strategy. Her presence signaled seriousness. Her involvement reassured stakeholders. Trust consolidated around her. At the same time, whispers began to circulate in spaces her parents once dominated. Questions arose. Concerns were raised. Assumptions were challenged. Nothing was public yet, but pressure was building. Alishba sensed the inevitability of exposure. Systems corrected themselves slowly, but thoroughly. When weaknesses surfaced, they did not retreat. She reflected on how her parents had once labeled her difficult, too intense, too demanding, too unwilling to conform. Those same traits now defined her strength. What they had rejected, the world had refined. Control, once lost, rarely returned in the same form. It required humility to adapt, and humility had never been part of their vocabulary. Alishba prepared herself emotionally, not for confrontation, but for recognition. For the moment when paths would intersect not as family, but as participants in the same accountability framework. She did not know how they would react. She did not know what they would ask of her, but she knew what she would not do. She would not compromise. The day control slipped from their hands was not marked on any calendar. There was no announcement, no single decision that defined it. It was the accumulation of enforced boundaries, unanswered expectations, and a system that no longer responded to entitlement. Alishba stood firmly within that system, not as its base, but as one of its foundations. And foundations do not move for anyone. Recognition does not always arrive with warmth. Sometimes it comes heavy, reluctant, shaped more by necessity than understanding. When Alishba's name finally entered her parents' conversations, it was not spoken with pride or affection. It surfaced because it could no longer be avoided. For years, they had referred to systems, committees, departments, and advisors without acknowledging the individuals behind them. Authority felt impersonal that way. Safer. But the closer scrutiny drew, the clearer it became that certain outcomes traced back to a single source of consistency: Alishba. Her influence had become identifiable. Not flashy, not public, but undeniable. Reports reflected her frameworks. Recommendations mirrored her assessments. Decisions aligned with structures she had reinforced. Her parents noticed the pattern the same way others did, through stalled progress and conditional approvals, through documents returned with annotations instead of signatures, through silence where compliance was missing. Eventually, curiosity overcame denial. They began asking questions not about her as a person, but about the professional footprint that bore her imprint. The answers led uncomfortably close to the truth. The child they had dismissed had become a gatekeeper to stability. This realization did not soften them. It unsettled them. Alishba felt the shift long before it reached her directly. She sensed the recalibration in how her work was referenced. Her name began appearing in formal contexts connected to cases adjacent to her parents' careers. Not as a family member, as an authority. She did not react outwardly. She maintained her rhythm, her standards, her emotional distance. But internally, the recognition stirred something complex. This was not reconciliation. This was acknowledgement under pressure. Her parents' first attempts to adapt were cautious. They sought to understand the system rather than confront it. They reviewed requirements more carefully. They adjusted language. They complied where they once assumed exemption. But adaptation felt foreign to them. Their reputations had always insulated them. Now, reputation required reinforcement. And reinforcement meant passing through processes Alishba helped shape. She observed their discomfort without judgment. Discomfort was part of correction. The moment her name was formally acknowledged did not occur in private. It occurred through documentation, through official correspondence, through structured references that stripped away emotional context and left only credentials. Alishba read the mention with a steady gaze. No satisfaction, no bitterness, just clarity. She understood the implication immediately. They knew, and knowing changed everything. From that point forward, interactions around their professional matters grew more careful. Requests were more deliberate. Compliance more visible. The system treated them no differently, but they treated the system with newfound caution. Alishba became aware of indirect attempts to influence outcomes. Not through pressure, but through alignment. Through signaling cooperation. Through demonstrating willingness to follow standards they once dismissed. She did not adjust her approach. Her integrity had never been situational. Internally, she reflected on how much effort it had taken for them to say her name in this context. How many barriers had existed before acknowledgement became unavoidable. It confirmed something she had long suspected. They had not rejected her because she lacked worth. They had rejected her because she challenged their comfort. Now that challenge had matured into authority. Alishba continued her work with the same discipline. She did not accelerate consequences. She did not delay them. She allowed the system to operate as designed. What changed was the emotional landscape. She felt the weight of being seen at last, even if the gaze was clinical. Recognition without empathy still altered the dynamic. It shifted the balance from dismissal to calculation. They could no longer pretend she was irrelevant. That knowledge carried power but also responsibility. Elishba grounded herself in purpose rather than emotion. She reminded herself why she had chosen this path. Not for validation, not for revenge, but to build systems that protected people from unchecked authority, including, ironically, from the kind her parents once embodied. As pressure mounted, it became clear that acknowledgement alone would not resolve their situation. Compliance could only go so far. Structural issues demanded deeper correction, and correction required cooperation. Elishba sensed the approach of a turning point, a moment when indirect acknowledgement would no longer suffice, when they would need more than awareness of her existence. They would need her involvement. Whether they were ready to face that reality remained uncertain. But the system was ready, and Elishba was prepared. Needing help changes the way people see the world. It compresses pride, exposes fear, and forces acknowledgement where denial once lived comfortably. For Elishba's parents, this need did not arrive suddenly. It accumulated through tightened timelines, unresolved compliance gaps, and increasing scrutiny that no longer responded to status. They reached a point where progress stalled completely. Projects critical to their careers hovered in uncertainty. Approvals remained pending. Reviews multiplied instead of concluding. The system had done what it was designed to do. It slowed momentum until accountability caught up. At that point, reputation alone could not carry them forward. Elishba sensed the shift not through emotion, but through structure. Requests began moving closer to her desk. Files adjacent to her parents' work required final validation from teams she supervised. Escalations referenced her frameworks explicitly. The system was narrowing options. Her parents recognized this narrowing with discomfort. Their professional survival now depended on navigating a structure that no longer responded to authority without verification. They needed clarity, strategy, and credibility within this new framework. They needed someone who understood it completely, and that someone was Elishba. The idea unsettled them, not because they doubted her competence, but because accepting it meant confronting their past decisions. It meant acknowledging that the daughter they had labeled unmanageable now held influence they could not bypass. They delayed as long as possible. But systems do not wait for emotional readiness. When the final constraint emerged, it became clear that indirect compliance would no longer suffice. Resolution required interpretation, restructuring, and assurance that future risks would be mitigated. This was Elishba's domain. The request, when it finally came, was not personal. It arrived as a procedural necessity, a professional requirement routed through appropriate channels. Elishba received it with composure. She reviewed the material thoroughly. She analyzed the risks objectively. She identified structural weaknesses without bias. She did not react to the names attached to the file. Her response was methodical. She outlined what would be required to stabilize the situation, the standards that must be met, the transparency that could no longer be postponed, the accountability measures that would need to be embedded permanently. The requirements were strict, but fair. What made them difficult was not complexity, but humility. Meeting them would require acknowledging oversight, accepting correction, allowing systems to function without interference. Elishba understood the cost of this transition. She had paid it herself years earlier, when rejection forced her to rebuild from nothing but discipline. She did not soften the process simply because it now affected her parents. Fairness demanded consistency. As the system responded to her recommendations, movement resumed. Slowly, cautiously, but unmistakably, approvals progressed. Reviews closed. Momentum returned under controlled conditions. Dependency solidified. Her parents' stability now rested on adherence to structures she had shaped. Their future required cooperation with principles they had once dismissed. Elishba observed this dependency with clarity. She did not mistake it for reconciliation. It was transactional, not emotional, but it was real. For the first time, they needed her not as a symbol, but as a solution. This shift altered the balance permanently. Elishba felt the gravity of this moment, not as victory, but as closure approaching. She had outgrown the need for their validation long ago. What remained was the question of how power should be handled when it finally arrives. She chose restraint. She did not exploit leverage. She did not delay assistance. She did not demand acknowledgement beyond what the system required. Her professionalism remained intact. That restraint carried its own weight. It forced her parents to confront the full reality of the reversal without distraction. There was no drama to hide behind, no emotional conflict to deflect responsibility, only outcomes. As progress stabilized, the system recorded success not under their names alone, but under the processes that enabled correction. Processes associated, quietly and unmistakably, with Elishba. The favor they never thought they would need had been granted, not out of obligation, but out of principle. And principles, once proven stronger than pride, change relationships forever. Elishba stood steady within that change. She understood that the final phase was approaching, the moment when professional dependency would intersect with personal reckoning. She did not rush toward it. She let it come. Some realizations arrive only after damage has settled into permanence. They do not undo what was done. They simply illuminate it. By the time Elishba's parents fully understood the cost of their choices, the distance between past and present had become unbridgeable. Their stability had returned, but it felt different now. Controlled, conditional, built on compliance rather than confidence. They could move forward, but only within boundaries they had not set. And those boundaries bore Elishba's imprint. As the immediate pressure eased, something else surfaced. Reflection. The kind that comes not from guilt, but from exhaustion. From recognizing that control had been replaced by cooperation, and that resistance no longer served any purpose. This was when the weight of the past finally settled in. They began to trace the path backward, to see patterns they had ignored, to recognize how easily they had labeled complexity as defiance, how quickly they had dismissed emotional depth as difficulty. The child they had pushed away had not broken under rejection. She had refined herself through it. That realization carried regret. Elishba felt the shift in tone long before any formal acknowledgement surfaced. The way her work was referenced softened. The rigidity around her involvement eased. There was less defensiveness, more care. Less urgency, more consideration. The system reflected this change subtly. Fewer escalations, more alignment, a growing sense of acceptance. But acceptance does not erase absence. Elishba remained steady. She noticed the shift without responding to it emotionally. Her work did not change. Her standards remained intact. She did not lean into reconciliation that had not been explicitly sought. And even if it had been, she was no longer waiting. When acknowledgement finally came, it arrived stripped of authority. It carried no expectations, no demands, only the quiet recognition that something valuable had been lost and could not be recovered through timing alone. Elishba processed this acknowledgement with composure. She had already grieved the relationship years ago, in solitude, in silence, through rebuilding herself without support. That grief had matured into acceptance long before this moment. Late apologies do not reopen closed wounds. They simply confirm why they closed. She understood now that her parents' regret was real, but reality did not guarantee relevance. Regret did not entitle reconciliation. Awareness did not obligate forgiveness. Elishba allowed space for this truth without resentment. She continued to operate within the same ethical framework. She fulfilled her responsibilities fully. She remained fair, consistent, and professional. But emotionally, she did not step backward. The system did not require emotional repair. It required compliance. That distinction mattered. Her parents adjusted accordingly. They no longer sought proximity. They respected distance. They complied without resistance. They moved carefully, aware that overreach would only reinforce separation. This shift marked a quiet ending. Not dramatic, not confrontational, just final. Elishba recognized that closure does not always come through resolution. Sometimes it comes through clarity, through seeing people exactly as they are, without hope of transformation. And sometimes that is enough. She turned her focus forward, toward the future she had built independently. toward the stability she had earned, toward the identity she had formed without external validation. The past no longer defined her. It informed her. As systems continued to function smoothly, her role remained essential but understated. She did not seek recognition. She did not require acknowledgement. Her strength lay in continuity. The apologies that arrived too late did not weaken her. They affirmed her resilience. They confirmed that she had been right to walk away when she did. Alishba moved forward without bitterness. She had already won something far more important than approval. She had won herself. Power reaches its true test not when it is gained, but when it can be used without consequence. By the time Alishba stood at that threshold, she understood the difference between influence and control more clearly than ever before. Influence shaped outcomes. Control demanded obedience. She had been shaped by the absence of both, and now possessed one without craving the other. Her position within the system had stabilized into permanence. She was no longer an emerging figure or a corrective presence. She was integral. Decisions flowed through the frameworks she had built. Her assessments shaped policy. Her standards anchored trust. With that permanence came discretion. There were moments when small adjustments could create large ripples, when timing, interpretation, or emphasis could tilt outcomes decisively. Alishba recognized these moments instantly. She knew where leverage existed, where flexibility lived, and where rigidity could be softened. She also knew where boundaries must remain untouched. Her parents' professional matters remained adjacent to her work. Not central, but close enough that her choices could influence trajectory. The system allowed her this reach. It trusted her judgment implicitly. This trust carried weight. Alishba reflected deeply during this phase. Not out of doubt, but out of responsibility. She revisited the years of rejection, the isolation, the rebuilding. She acknowledged the pain without allowing it to dictate action. What defined her now was not what had been taken from her, but what she chose to do with what she had earned. She considered the paths available to her. Some would feel justified. Some would feel corrective. Some would feel invisible to everyone but herself. She chose the one that aligned with her values. She did nothing extra. She did nothing less. She allowed the system to operate exactly as designed. No intervention, no obstruction, no personalization. This neutrality was not passive. It was deliberate. By refusing to bend the system in either direction, she affirmed its integrity. She protected it from becoming a tool of emotion or history. She preserved the fairness she had worked so hard to build. Her parents continued to move forward within that structure. Not elevated, not punished, simply accountable. This outcome carried more weight than any act of revenge could have. Alishba felt a quiet certainty settle within her. This was the moment that defined everything. The moment she chose who she would be, when no one could stop her from choosing otherwise. She understood then that healing does not come from reversing harm. It comes from refusing to replicate it. Her parents' perception of her shifted subtly after this phase. They recognized not just her authority, but her restraint. They saw that her power did not seek validation through dominance. That realization altered how they carried themselves. For Alishba, the shift was internal. She released the last remnants of expectation. She no longer needed acknowledgement, apology, or understanding. Her life had grown beyond those needs. The system continued to thrive. Transparency deepened. Accountability normalized. The environment became safer for those without influence. Alishba's presence ensured this continuity. She moved forward with clarity. Her past no longer tugged at her decisions. It had become context, not burden. The choice she made in silence reshaped everything. Not because it punished those who had hurt her, but because it proved she was no longer shaped by them. Loss is not always loud. Sometimes it does not announce itself through collapse or regret. Sometimes it reveals itself slowly, through absence. Through the quiet understanding that something irreplaceable once existed and was dismissed too easily to be recovered. Alishba's parents continued their lives within the stability the system allowed them. Their careers did not end. their reputations did not vanish. From the outside, everything appeared intact, but something essential had shifted permanently. They moved forward without influence over the one person who understood them more deeply than anyone else ever could. They had lost proximity to clarity. Alishba's presence in the system was constant, but distant. She was no longer someone they could shape, manage, or define. She had become something far more unreachable. Independent authority. They observed her success from afar, not as parents witnessing growth, but as professionals witnessing competence they could not claim credit for. Her achievements carried no trace of their guidance, no reflection of their support. That absence was unmistakable. They realized, too late, that what they had called difficult had been depth. What they had labeled unlovable had been honesty. What they had rejected had been strength that required understanding rather than control. By the time this realization settled fully, Alishba no longer lived in the emotional space where it mattered. She had built a life that did not orbit around approval. Her identity no longer bent toward acceptance. She stood firmly within herself, supported by principles she had chosen and upheld alone. The system she helped maintain reflected that same independence. It did not favor history. It did not reward regret. It functioned on accountability alone. Her parents learned to live within that reality. They complied. They adapted. They aged into restraint. What they lost was not access or opportunity. They lost intimacy. They lost the right to claim understanding of the woman Alishba had become. They lost the ability to influence her values, to shape her direction, to be part of her internal world. That loss did not come with blame. It came with silence. Alishba did not close the door dramatically. She simply did not reopen it. Her future unfolded steadily. She invested in her work, her growth, her chosen connections. She surrounded herself with people who valued complexity rather than fearing it. She no longer questioned whether she was too much. She knew she had always been exactly enough. Her strength matured into wisdom. Her resilience softened into peace. She carried no need to prove what had already been proven through time and consistency. The girl who had been cut off became the woman who defined boundaries others learned to respect. And those who had once dismissed her learned a quiet truth that could not be corrected. When they let her go, they did not lose a problem. They lost their greatest certainty. Alishba moved forward without looking back, not because she was bitter, but because she was free. Life did not slow down after everything settled. It expanded, quietly, steadily, without needing permission from the past. Alishba stepped fully into the future she had been building long before recognition arrived. Her days were structured but calm. Purpose replaced urgency. She no longer measured progress by survival, but by alignment. The work she did continued to shape environments that valued fairness over familiarity, structure over sentiment. She was trusted not because she demanded it, but because she had earned it consistently. Outside of work, her world grew softer. She learned to rest without guilt, to choose people who met her with curiosity instead of control, to create spaces where complexity was welcomed rather than corrected. Her relationships were intentional, grounded in mutual respect rather than obligation. The past faded into context. It no longer defined her reactions or shaped her decisions. It existed as a chapter that had taught her discernment, resilience, and the importance of boundaries. She did not erase it. She simply no longer lived inside it. Occasionally, she reflected on how far she had come, not with disbelief, but with gratitude, for the solitude that had forced self-trust, for the rejection that had redirected her growth, for the silence that had taught her how to listen to herself. She understood now that being hard to love had never been the truth. She had simply required honesty. And honesty, she knew, demanded courage many people never developed. Alishba carried herself with ease. She no longer felt the need to explain her worth or soften her edges. She had learned that strength and gentleness could coexist, and that neither required permission to exist. Her life was not perfect, but it was hers, built deliberately, lived consciously, protected carefully. She had become the kind of person who did not chase closure, because she embodied it. The kind who did not seek validation because she trusted her own reflection. The kind who did not repeat harm because she understood its cost. The girl who was once cut off had grown into a woman who chose connection without surrender. And that choice shaped everything that came after. Alishba was never too hard to love. She was simply too honest for people who loved control more than connection. From a young age, she learned that affection in her home came with conditions, and questions were treated like defiance. The more she tried to understand, the more she was pushed away. When her parents finally cut her off, they believed distance would restore order. Instead, it forced Alishba to build herself without comfort, without approval, and without permission. She learned quickly that the world rewards structure, not emotion. So she mastered systems, discipline, and responsibility. Years later, the girl they abandoned stood inside the very frameworks that now governed their careers. Not seeking revenge, not seeking validation, simply existing as proof that rejection does not break the right person. Sometimes, being called unlovable is just the beginning of becoming unstoppable.